When justice wears a different face than expected, power dynamics shift in ways that reveal the true character of all involved. The words echoed in Michael Johnson's mind as he stared at the eviction notice in his hands. A cruel irony for a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law. The Johnsons had lived in the red brick Victorian on Maple Street for nearly 5 years. Not the longest time, but long enough for the roots of their family life to sink deep into the soil of this quiet neighborhood. Long enough for their daughter Zoe's height marks to climb the kitchen doorframe, for their son Marcus to learn to ride his bike on the driveway, and for memories to be folded into every corner of the house they called home. What the Johnsons didn't know was that their landlord, Gerald Whitman, had been watching property values in the area climb steadily upward. The neighborhood was changing, as people like to say, a word that carried different meanings, depending on who was speaking. For Gerald, it meant opportunity. For the Johnsons, it would soon mean something else entirely. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a cable bill and a fundraising flyer for Marcus's school. Diane Johnson, still in her hospital scrubs after a 12-hour shift as a nurse, flipped through the mail while waiting for the kettle to boil. When she saw the formal envelope with the property management company's logo, something tightened in her chest. "You're home early," she said, trying to sound casual as her husband Michael entered the kitchen, loosening his tie. Michael Johnson didn't look like what most people expected when they heard he was a judge. At 42, his face still carried the softness of youth, his smile quick and genuine. Only the slight gray at his temples and the depth in his eyes hinted at the weight of the decisions he made daily. "Court adjourned early. Thought I'd surprise you." Michael kissed her cheek, then noticed the envelope in her hand. "What's that?" Diane's fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. "It's from Whitman Properties." Michael watched her face as she read. The way her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something harder. "They're terminating our lease," she said quietly. 60 days notice." "What? Let me see that." Michael took the letter, his eyes scanning quickly. "This doesn't make sense. We've never been late on rent. We've improved this place. Remember when I fixed the back porch steps after asking them for months?" Diane sank into a kitchen chair, her exhaustion suddenly more pronounced. "They don't need a reason, Michael. It's their property. But we have rights as tenants. This isn't just about property, it's about people's lives." Michael's voice took on the same measured tone he used in his courtroom. "There are laws protecting against certain types of evictions." Zoe, their 16-year-old daughter, appeared in the doorway, headphones around her neck. "What's going on?" Michael and Diane exchanged glances. They had always been honest with their children, believing that protection came from knowledge, not ignorance. "Mr. Whitman wants us to move out," Michael explained. "But why?" Zoe's voice cracked slightly. "This is our home." "That's what we're going to find out," Michael assured her, though his own mind was racing with possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. The next day, Michael called the property management office. After being transferred twice, he finally reached Gerald Whitman himself. "Mr. Whitman, this is Michael Johnson. I received your letter about terminating our lease." "Yes, Mr. Johnson." Whitman's voice was professionally distant. As the letter states, we're providing the 60 days notice required by law. "I understand that, but I'm curious about the reason. We've been model tenants." There was a pause on the line. "We're looking to make some upgrades to the property. The market in that area is changing." Michael noted the careful choice of words. "Changing how exactly?" "Property values are increasing. We're planning to renovate and adjust the rent accordingly." "I see. And if we were willing to pay an increased rent?" Another pause. "The renovations would require the property to be vacant. I'm afraid the decision is final." After hanging up, Michael sat at his desk, staring at the family photo taken last Christmas. Marcus in his new basketball jersey, Zoe with her hair braided in the style she'd been experimenting with, Diane's arm around his waist. Their home formed the backdrop, the large bay window in the living room, the bookshelf he'd built himself. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Michael shared what he'd learned. "So they're kicking us out to make more money," Marcus said, his 14-year-old face twisted with indignation. "It's more complicated than that," Michael replied, though he wasn't sure it was. "But I'm going to look into our options." Diane reached across the table for his hand. "Michael, we can find another place. Maybe it's time we looked into buying anyway." "That's not the point," Michael said quietly. "This isn't just about us. What about Mrs. Rivera downstairs? Or the Chens across the hall? They received notices too." "How do you know?" Zoe asked. "I ran into Mrs. Rivera this morning. She was crying, Zoe. She's lived here for 12 years. Silence fell over the table as they all considered the ripple effects of what was happening. "So what do we do?" Marcus finally asked. Michael squeezed Diane's hand. "First, we understand our rights. Then, we decide how to proceed." The next day, Michael visited the local housing authority. As a judge on the state Supreme Court, he was well versed in the law, but he specialized in constitutional matters, not housing regulations. What he discovered troubled him deeply. While the eviction appeared legal on the surface, there were patterns emerging in the neighborhood that suggested a more concerning picture. 3 other buildings owned by Whitman Properties had undergone similar upgrades in the past year. In each case, long-term tenants, predominantly families of color, had been displaced, and the renovated units had been rented at significantly higher rates to new tenants. When Michael returned home, he found Diane at the kitchen table with Mrs. Rivera and Mr. Chun, spreading out apartment listings and comparing notes. "We're pooling resources," Diane explained. "If we're going to be forced out, at least we can help each other find new places." Michael nodded, his heart swelling with pride at his wife's natural leadership and compassion. But behind his smile, a determination was hardening. This wasn't just about finding a new home anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger than themselves. "Before we go further with apartment hunting," he said, settling into a chair, "I think we need to have a conversation about what's really happening here and what we can do about it." The others looked at him expectantly, hope and wariness mixing in their expressions. Michael took a deep breath, knowing that the path ahead would be challenging but necessary. "I believe there's a pattern here that needs to be addressed, and I think we have grounds to challenge this eviction, not just for us, but for everyone in this building." In the days that followed, the Johnson home became an unexpected headquarters for what Michael had started calling a community response. The kitchen table, where family meals had been shared and homework completed, transformed into a strategy center, covered with legal documents, tenant rights pamphlets, and contact information for everyone in the building. "You realize what you're starting here, don't you?" Diane asked one evening, after the neighbors had left and the children had gone to bed. She stood in the doorway, watching her husband pore over housing statutes. Michael looked up, his eyes tired but clear. "I'm not starting anything. I'm responding to something that's already happening. There's a difference." Diane sat beside him, gently closing the law book. "I know you, Michael Johnson. You don't just respond, you transform. It's what made me fall in love with you at law school, and it's what makes you a brilliant judge, but it also makes you a target." Her words hung between them, heavy with unspoken history, the challenges they'd faced as a black family moving into this predominantly white neighborhood 5 years ago, the polite smiles that didn't reach eyes, the surprise that sometimes flickered across faces when people learned Michael's profession. "We can just move," she continued, her voice soft but not yielding. "We have options others don't." Michael took her hands in his. "And that's exactly why we can't just walk away. This isn't just about housing, Diane. It's about who gets to belong where, who gets to put down roots, and who gets uprooted when the soil becomes valuable." The next morning, Michael requested a meeting with Gerald Whitman at the property management office. He didn't mention his profession, asking only for 15 minutes of the landlord's time to discuss the eviction notices. The Whitman Properties office occupied the first floor of a sleek downtown building, all glass and chrome, with a reception area that smelled of synthetic lemon and ambition. Michael, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks rather than his usual courtroom attire, was directed to a conference room where Gerald Whitman waited. Whitman was younger than Michael had expected, perhaps mid-30s, with carefully styled hair and a casual confidence that came from inherited rather than earned security. He stood as Michael entered, extending his hand with practiced charm. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming in. Though I'm not sure there's much to discuss. The decision is unfortunately final." Michael shook his hand, noting the firmness of Whitman's grip, the handshake of someone who had been taught that confidence could be conveyed through physical pressure. "I appreciate you taking the time," Michael said, settling into a chair. "I wanted to understand the situation more fully, especially since it affects not just my family, but several others in the building." Whitman leaned back, a slight smile playing at his lips. "It's simple economics, Mr. Johnson. The neighborhood is improving, property values are rising, and we're positioning our assets accordingly." "Improving," Michael repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "That's an interesting choice of words. What metrics are you using to measure this improvement?" Something shifted in Whitman's expression, a momentary falter in his smile. The usual indicators: new businesses opening, crime rates decreasing, average income rising, and average skin tone lightening. Michael asked, his voice neutral but his gaze steady. The smile disappeared entirely now. "I don't appreciate what you're implying, Mr. Johnson." "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking direct questions about a pattern that's difficult to ignore. In the past year, you've evicted tenants from 3 other properties in changing neighborhoods. In each case, long-term residents, predominantly families of color, were replaced after renovations with new tenants paying significantly higher rents." Whitman's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation with no basis in fact. We make business decisions based on market conditions, not demographics." "Yet the effect is the same," Michael replied. "And effects matter in law, regardless of stated intent." "Law?" Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you an attorney, Mr. Johnson?" Michael paused, considering his response. He hadn't come to leverage his position, but neither would he hide it. "I'm familiar with housing law," he said carefully, "enough to recognize when patterns suggest potential violations of the Fair Housing Act." Whitman's laugh held no humor. "Listen, I understand you're upset about having to move, but throwing around legal threats isn't going to change anything. This is business, not personal." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Whitman. Housing is always personal. It's about people's lives, their communities, their sense of belonging and security." Michael reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "I've taken the liberty of compiling some information. The eviction notices for all current tenants in our building, compared with rental listings for your renovated properties. The demographic changes in tenant composition, the timing of these changes relative to neighborhood development plans." He slid the folder across the table. "I'm not here to threaten legal action, though that remains an option. I'm here to propose an alternative approach that respects both your business interests and the community that already exists." Whitman didn't touch the folder. "And what exactly would that entail?" "A phased renovation plan that allows current tenants first right of return at graduated rent increases, community input on improvements, perhaps even a partnership with the city's Affordable Housing Initiative, which offers tax incentives for mixed-income developments." For a moment, something like genuine consideration flickered across Whitman's face. Then his expression hardened again. "Mr. Johnson, while I appreciate your creativity, the reality is that I don't have to do any of those things. The law is clear. With proper notice, which we've provided, we have the right to terminate leases and use our property as we see fit." Michael nodded slowly. "You're right about the letter of the law, in most cases. But patterns of displacement that disproportionately affect protected classes open the door to fair housing complaints." He leaned forward slightly, "and those can become quite costly and public." Whitman's face flushed. "Is that a threat?" "It's a prediction, based on experience. These situations rarely remain private matters once they gain momentum. And they've gained momentum, Mr. Whitman. The tenants are organizing. The local housing advocacy group has been contacted. Several journalists have expressed interest in the pattern emerging across your properties. This wasn't entirely true, not yet, but Michael had made enough calls to know it could be reality within days if necessary. Whitman stood abruptly. I think we're done here. If you want to waste your money on lawyers, that's your choice. But Whitman Properties operates fully within the law. Michael remained seated. Before I go, there's one more thing you should know. I wasn't entirely forthcoming about my familiarity with housing law. Whitman paused, his hand on the door. In addition to being your tenant, Michael continued quietly, I serve as an associate justice on the state Supreme Court, where I've written opinions on several housing discrimination cases. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of silence that marks a fundamental shift in a conversation, in a relationship, in a power dynamic. Whitman turned slowly, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief, calculation, and dawning recognition. You're Justice Johnson? The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Michael nodded once. I am. But today, I'm here as Michael Johnson, a tenant concerned about his community, a father worried about his children having to change schools, a neighbor troubled by the displacement of people like Mrs. Rivera, who has nowhere else to go. He stood now, gathering his materials. I'd like you to review the proposal in that folder, Mr. Whitman, not because of my position, but because it represents a path forward that could work for everyone involved. I'll call you tomorrow to discuss your thoughts. As Michael turned to leave, Whitman found his voice again. Justice Johnson. Michael paused, hand on the doorknob. I didn't know, Whitman said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Michael looked back at him, his expression neither condemning nor forgiving. That's precisely the problem, Mr. Whitman. You didn't know, or perhaps didn't care to know, who was being affected by your decisions. The stories, the lives, the communities. When we reduce people to entries in a ledger, we miss the humanity that should guide our choices. He opened the door. I'll call tomorrow. I hope we can find a solution that recognizes both your rights as a property owner and our rights as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. As Michael walked through the reception area and into the bright afternoon sunlight, he felt both the weight and the purpose of the path ahead. This wasn't just about keeping his family's home. It was about standing at the intersection of personal experience and professional responsibility, using his position not to demand privilege, but to illuminate injustice. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane. How did it go? Michael looked back at the gleaming building before typing his response. He knows who I am now. But more importantly, I think he's beginning to see who we all are. The Johnson family's dining room had transformed. What was once a space for quiet family meals now hummed with the energy of collective purpose. Around the large oak table, a wedding gift from Diane's grandmother, sat not just the Johnsons, but a cross-section of their building's community. Mrs. Rivera with her carefully organized notebook, Mr. Chun with his teenage son translating, the Williams family from the third floor, and several others who had received identical eviction notices. The way I see it, Michael explained, his voice carrying the measured calm that had become a lifeline for many in the room. We have multiple paths forward, and they're not mutually exclusive. Zoe moved around the table, refilling water glasses and placing a fresh plate of cookies at the center. At 16, she had stepped naturally into the role of host and supporter, understanding instinctively that this gathering was about more than legal strategy. It was about nurturing the bonds of community under threat. Mr. Whitman has agreed to meet with tenant representatives next week, Michael continued. That's a significant shift from his initial position. Because he found out you're a big-shot judge, commented Terrell Williams, whose skepticism had been earned through decades of witnessing promises made and broken to communities like theirs. Michael met his gaze directly. My position created an opening, yes, but it's the collective power in this room that will determine what happens next. Diane, seated beside Mrs. Rivera with a supportive hand on the older woman's shoulder, spoke up. We need to be clear about what we're asking for, not just for ourselves, but for future tenants who might not have a Supreme Court justice among them. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the room, easing the tension. The willingness to find moments of lightness amid struggle. This, too, was a form of resistance, Michael reflected. Diane's right, he said. This isn't just about stopping our evictions. It's about establishing principles that protect community stability and housing justice beyond our individual situations. Marcus, who had been quietly observing from his perch on the windowsill, raised his hand tentatively. Though only 14, he had been absorbing everything. The legal discussions, the community organizing strategies, the personal stories shared around their table. Yes, Marcus. Michael acknowledged him with the same respect he would give any adult in the room. What if, Marcus began, his adolescent voice still navigating its changing register, instead of just fighting Mr. Whitman, we try to help him see things differently. Like, maybe he doesn't know what it means to be rooted somewhere. The room fell quiet, considering the wisdom in the boy's words. That's a profound insight, Michael said, pride evident in his voice. And it speaks to something essential about this struggle. It's not just about legal rights. It's about helping people recognize the humanity they've been trained to ignore in the name of profit. The next morning, as Michael prepared for work, he found Zoe sitting on the front porch steps. The early autumn air carried just enough chill to turn her breath visible in small, ephemeral clouds. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting beside her. Zoe kept her gaze fixed on the maple tree across the street, its leaves just beginning their transformation. "Is this what you do in court every day? Try to make people see each other as human?" Michael considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. That's what justice should be about. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it falls short. "The way you talked to everyone last night." She turned to face him. "You weren't talking like a judge. You were talking like what?" "Like someone who knows what it feels like to be seen as less than, to be disposable." Michael felt the familiar ache that came with watching his children encounter the world's harsh realities, the instinct to protect warring with the necessity of preparing them. "Everyone in that room knows that feeling," he said quietly, "including me. Especially me. The robe doesn't change that experience. It just gives me a different position from which to address it." Zoe nodded, absorbing this. Then, with the remarkable resilience of youth, she straightened her shoulders. "I'm going to design flyers for the tenant association, Marcus, and I thought we could distribute them to other buildings Mr. Whitman owns." Michael smiled, recognizing in his daughter the same determination that had carried him through law school, through countless moments of being the only black face in rooms where decisions were made. "That's a brilliant idea. But remember—" I know, Zoe interrupted with a teenager's practiced exasperation, though her eyes were bright with purpose. "We're not just fighting against something. We're building towards something better." The meeting with Gerald Whitman and the tenant representatives took place not at the sleek downtown office, but in the community room of the local library, neutral ground that symbolized something important about the shifting power dynamics. Whitman arrived flanked by his lawyer and a public relations consultant, a clear indication that Michael's prediction about the situation potentially becoming public had registered. The landlord's usual casual confidence seemed dimmed, replaced by a cautious formality. The tenant representatives, Michael, Mrs. Rivera, and Terrell Williams, sat across the table. They had decided that while Michael's legal knowledge was invaluable, his role would be as a tenant and community member, not as Justice Johnson. This wasn't about leveraging individual power, but about exercising collective voice. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Michael began. "We appreciate the opportunity to find a path forward that respects everyone's interests." Whitman nodded stiffly. "I want to be clear that Whitman Properties has operated entirely within the law. We're here as a courtesy." "We understand your position," Michael replied, his tone neither confrontational nor deferential. "And we're here to share ours, not as adversaries, but as community members with deep stakes in the outcome of your business decisions." For the next hour, the tenant representatives took turns, sharing not just their legal concerns, but their lived experiences. Mrs. Rivera spoke of the garden she had cultivated for 12 years in the building's backyard, how it had become a source of fresh vegetables for elderly neighbors on fixed incomes. Terrell described how the building's proximity to his children's school had allowed his wife to secure work without the burden of lengthy commutes or expensive childcare. Michael noticed a subtle shift in Whitman's demeanor as these stories unfolded, a reluctant but undeniable engagement with the human consequences his business strategy had never accounted for. "These are compelling personal situations," Whitman's lawyer interjected, clearly attempting to redirect the conversation. "But my client has to make decisions based on market realities." "We're not suggesting that Mr. Whitman ignore economic factors," Michael countered. "We're proposing that he expand his definition of value to include community stability and equitable development." He slid forward a document, the refined version of the proposal he had first presented in Whitman's office, now enhanced with input from all the building's tenants and supporting data from housing advocacy organizations. This outlines a phased renovation approach that would allow current tenants to remain while improvements are made incrementally. It includes provisions for modest, graduated rent increases and first right of refusal for any units that do become vacant. Additionally, it proposes a partnership with the city's mixed-income housing initiative, which would provide tax benefits for Whitman properties. The PR consultant leaned toward Whitman, whispering something. Whitman listened, then turned his attention back to the tenant representatives. "And if we were to consider this approach," he said carefully, "what assurances do we have that there won't be additional complications?" Michael recognized the subtext. "Mr. Whitman, our goal here is resolution, not confrontation. The Tenant Association has prepared a statement expressing appreciation for your willingness to engage in this dialogue and explore collaborative solutions. We're ready to share that publicly as soon as we reach an agreement in principle." Something like relief flickered across Whitman's face. "There's something else you should know," Michael added. "Yesterday, I received calls from 3 different developers interested in exploring community-centered renovation models similar to what we're proposing. They've recognized that sustainable development requires maintaining community fabric, not just upgrading physical structures. This approach isn't just morally sound, it's becoming a new business standard." This wasn't a threat, but an invitation, a chance for Whitman to position himself as a forward-thinking businessman rather than an antagonist in a potential housing discrimination case. The meeting concluded with no firm commitments, but a schedule for follow-up discussions and a handshake that carried more genuine engagement than their first encounter. As they left the library, Terrell voiced what they were all feeling. "He's considering it. Actually considering it." "Yes," Michael agreed. "But more importantly, he's beginning to see us, to really see us. And that's where lasting change begins." 2 weeks later, the Johnsons hosted another gathering around their dining table. This time, the atmosphere was different, celebratory but tempered with the knowledge that they had won an opening, not a conclusion. Whitman Properties had agreed to a modified version of their proposal. Current tenants would have the option to remain during phased renovations, with rent increases capped at 5% annually for the next 3 years. The property company would partner with the city's affordable housing initiative to maintain 30% of units at below-market rates, and the tenant advisory board would provide input on renovation priorities. "It's not perfect," Diane acknowledged as she raised her glass of sparkling cider, "but it's a foundation we can build on." "To foundations," Mrs. Rivera echoed, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. Later that evening, after their guests had departed and the children had gone to bed, Michael and Diane sat on the front porch swing that had witnessed countless family conversations. "You know," Diane said softly, "when that eviction notice came, I never imagined we'd end up here, not just keeping our home, but helping establish a model that could protect other communities." Michael nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "It's what you said to me that night, remember? You said I don't just respond to things. I transform them." "We transformed this," she corrected him. "All of us together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the streetlights illuminate the path of their neighborhood. The same streets, the same houses, but something fundamental had shifted, not just in their security of tenure, but in the collective awareness of their power to shape the spaces they inhabited. Justice isn't just what happens in courtrooms, Michael reflected. It's what we create together when we refuse to be defined by someone else's calculation of our worth. Diane rested her head against his shoulder. That sounds like something you should put in your next judicial opinion. Maybe I will, he said with a smile. But first, I think we need to help Marcus with that science project. Did you see the volcano he's building? I have serious concerns about our kitchen ceiling. Their laughter drifted into the night air, the sound of a family rooted not just in place, but in purpose. Their home now, carrying the added dimension of having been defended and reimagined through collective action. The maple tree across the street stood witness, its leaves continuing their gradual transformation, a reminder that change, when approached with intention and care, could unfold without uprooting what matters most.